American Handgunner Insider.
Hey folks, Tom McHale here with another episode of American Handgunner Insider. As promised on our last show, we've got a special guest today, Dr. Will Dabbs. You know him. He writes everything everywhere, right?
Not quite, but if I've weaponized a bad case of insomnia, we'll just leave it at that.
See, I heard you owned the Library of Congress, and that kind of
I
explains the volume, but...
I bought it at auction. Yeah.
You- you- okay, so that actually is kind of a good segue, because I would go out on a limb. We're going to talk about the Guns of Alcatraz today, and we'll explain more of that in a minute. But I would bet even money that you have a gun somewhere around your place that you bought at auction, maybe because one of these guns we're going to talk about. Did you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I figured.
As ridiculous as this sounds, before I came in here, the FedEx guys, there's the white truck of happiness and the brown truck of happiness. This was the white truck of happiness. They delivered a big honking box, and I opened it up in the presence of my wife, and it's an antique, really nasty grizzly bear rug that's like probably shot by Teddy Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln. And I dragged that thing out of the box, and my poor wife is like, where are you going to put that stupid thing? So yeah, we passed addiction a long time ago. I saw it on a gun auction. Somebody had an old nasty bear rug, and I thought maybe I'll use it as a backdrop for a gun article at some point. So yeah, now I have a grizzly bear rug. It was
So
cheap.
you realize your bride is a keeper, right? If she tolerates this stuff. Okay.
She's going to get some kind of medal before it's all over.
Nice. Well, let's dive into the cool stuff today. So we're going to talk about Guns of Alcatraz, and just to be clear, I have to assume that it would have been pretty darn tough for a prisoner to get a gun into Alcatraz, but on the other side of the prisoner guard relationship, they were somewhat well armed. For those of you not familiar with Alcatraz, this was I guess a federal prison, U.S. Justice Department, right?
Originally, it was a military prison, and then it transferred to just as a federal prison.
Okay, so an island out in the middle of San Francisco Bay somewhere, surrounded by very cold, high current water, a number of escape attempts over time. I think in your article you mentioned there were something like 14 documented escape attempts over the years, and as far as we know, none were successful?
Some fascinating rumors. If I remember correctly, there were a handful of guys who were never found, and there were rumors that they had survived because one of them, his mom, got flowers on her birthday every year for whatever. But yeah, the possibility of anybody getting off of that thing alive was very small.
Yeah. So, and you think about the kind of people, I guess it opened as a prison for regular bad folks, 33 or something, and ran for 30 years, give or take. But they had the worst of the worst. I mean, we're talking Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, right?
Yeah, Whitey Bulger. That was the refuse basket, the rubbish bin for the worst of the worst. Some famous folks there.
So,
Alvin Carpus.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote this article for the current issue of Handgunner. If you haven't seen it yet, it should be out any day, depending on when you watch this video. And it kind of inspired this topic. I figured it'd be great fun to talk about. But you were talking about this, and I got to thinking some of these guys had a heck of a lot of money. I forget the figure, but in modern day dollars, Capone was just obscenely wealthy, and you have to kind of a drug lord wealthy, and you have to think he probably had the funds to mount an invasion of Alcatraz.
Well, you think about the kind of paramilitary capabilities that the drug cartels in Mexico have, and I once again, I wish I'd thought to kind of research it a bit. I've written about Capone before, and I think he was the equivalent of a billionaire. I mean, he had particularly for that era, during the Depression when nobody had any money, he was insanely, lyrically, unimaginably wealthy. And he would have been able to call upon the resources of a small nation state if that's what it took. So for them to prepare for a legitimate amphibious invasion was not as unreasonable as it might seem.
Well, and that's kind of a great segue into the guns. I mean, okay, why don't we do this? Let's start with the little stuff, and then we'll kind of we'll kind of get into the bigger scenarios that the authorities were prepared for in this island. So when you dug into this, what did you find for the?
Well, for starters, given the size and obviously expense of this facility, it didn't carry, it didn't hold a lot of prisoners. There were only about 350 guys who lived there.
Mhm.
And then the full-time guard staff was about 150, a bit less than half as many folks who guarded the prisoners as were actually living there. So considering, as we were discussing earlier, it was just a very different time. If somebody got shot trying to escape, it was just not as big a deal as it is now. And so they were seriously armed up and had a surprisingly large number of 22 caliber weapons, both handguns and rifles. And originally was thinking when I was digging through this, that was probably for training purposes. But actually, I found a reference somewhere that they assumed that you would use those to shoot to wound. And having seen more than a handful of folks expire from having been shot with a 22 rimfire, that's quite very lethal. Plenty of penetration, all kinds of mischief, even in the extremities. But the mindset of the day was if you didn't want to kill somebody, you just shoot them through the leg with a 22 and they'll probably be fine.
It's longer, right, to be lethal.
It just takes a minute. But yeah, they had a lot of 22 caliber weapons, a bunch of 38 caliber revolvers, 1911 pistols. If I remember correctly, it had about 30 1911s, and the military weapons were on long-term loan from the military. So they were GI guns. But the standard handguns were, and to be honest, I'm no Venturino as far as wheel guns are concerned, but a variety of Colt, in particular, 38 wheel guns and a bunch of 1911s.
Positives, I think, was the predominant model they had on hand. So. Huh.
Yeah. But certainly enough to, if you couldn't arm every guard there, you could arm most of them. And as I said in the article, as you might imagine, the weapons were stored well away from the inmates, and any guards who interacted with the inmates were by design and by regulation unarmed for obvious reasons. Though there was a notorious situation wherein some of the inmates got into the weapons and caused all manner of mischief. But yeah, but plenty of handguns.
Yeah, that was Barney Coy, I think, was the guy who found that story and wrote it up. Real bad dude. And one of the things that I found fascinating in your article was he apparently went on a discrete starvation diet for a period of time because the guns were stored in a locked room protected by steel bars and they were close together. And he was built himself some tools to spread them apart a little bit, and he still had to fit through there to get access to the firearms.
Well, and these, to put it in psychiatric terms, these guys had antisocial personality disorder. It's like a congenital absence of conscience. And they would have hurt or killed anybody it took to get what they wanted, both inside the prison and out. So, yeah, he planned that for a long time, starved himself to get through the bars, and then he went out in a blaze of glory as a result.
Yep. Yeah, well, hey, you know what? While we're on that story, I think we got to stick with it for a minute because that was one of my favorite parts. The whole story you put together on this thing is that he got access to some rifles. He broke out a couple other prisoners, armed them too, and they were going to make a break with hostages, I guess, of prison guards. They were going to make a break for the dock and take a boat, and then who knows what after that. But apparently they lost track of a key or couldn't get to the dock or something. So it all went south.
They had a great plan to get them to the dock. And then I don't think they really thought much beyond that. And criminals are not one of the guys involved. I remember had an IQ of 68. They're not necessarily the smartest kids on the block, but they're certainly motivated. But I don't think their plan went much beyond let's get off the island and figure it out when we get there.
I think just in a show of we're not messing around with prisoner revolts, they apparently they brought in a couple of platoons of Marines fresh back from World War II in the Pacific. If you think about it, it's basically a bunker clearing operation, right?
It is. Those were some bad men. And well, once again, it's a good segue. It was just a different time, as what we were discussing earlier. My grandfather was born in 1901, and so he came of age in sort of the same era that we're talking about here, and he worked for the railroad. And as we were discussing, MSNBC had a headline recently that Laken Riley's murderer didn't stand a chance, and it's aggravated people like us that you could really care what would happen to that guy, considering he raped and murdered an innocent woman. But it was not always like that in America. And there was a guy who was climbing up a gutter and breaking into the second floor window at the railroad depot, and this happened twice. And he was getting in there and stealing money. And so the train master just brought his personal 12 gauge side by side and wired it to a chair and set it up in front of the window. And my grandfather said the next morning they showed up just like a mousetrap. The guy who had been breaking into the depot was just dead, shot in the chest with 2 loads of double-aught buck as he lifted the window. And while that's an interesting story, I remember my grandfather telling me that it never occurred to anybody that there was any criminal component there. Just the sheriff came out, mopped everything up. Good job. Have a great day. But it did not enter anybody's mind that there was any culpability for the station master having done that. And it's just a very different time from the 1920s to the present. I can only imagine what would occur if something like that were to unfold nowadays. But back then, as far as long guns are concerned, they had bolt action Model 70s and 30-06. I can't imagine you'd use that for much more than shooting prisoners in the back as they're running off, or this hypothetical amphibious invasion situation. They had 1928 Thompsons, M2 carbines. They were loaded for bear. And if they ended up just machine gunning the prisoners because that's what it took, I think that they probably could have gotten away with it.
Yeah, I mean, lots of shotguns too.
18 trench guns.
Yeah, I remember you were talking at one point about the original armament included a number of M1 carbines and a heck of a lot of ammunition. I'm trying to remember the figure. I think you figured out through the records there were something like 11,000 rounds of ammo for the carbines, and then after that,
with 30-06.
Wow. So invasion proof. So the rumor we were talking about before we hit the record button here is that there have been stories of crew served weapons on Alcatraz too, which absolutely would support we're not tolerating any invasion attempts to pick up wealthy prisoners, right?
I think when I was researching this, I found a detailed inventory of all the weapons, but I didn't find any references to crew served guns. But back in the back of my head somewhere, I think I've seen a Browning 1917 water-cooled 30 cal that was sold at auction that claimed to have been used at Alcatraz. And I think it was electropenciled or marked accordingly. But I couldn't find any reference to it. I've got that back in my 58-year-old dusty mind someplace that I'd seen that for sale many years ago.
Maybe this is purely hypothetical on my part. That attempted breakout we were talking about earlier was it Barney Coy and gang. The Marines came in to end that thing, and as I recall, they ended up cutting holes in the ceiling of wherever these guys were holed up and dropping grenades in there. I wonder if they brought some crew served gear with them. Maybe that's where that story comes from.
Yeah, I'd be surprised otherwise. And once again, those were some hard dudes, and they would not have put up with a lot of foolishness, I suspect.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess from my understanding, it was after that attempt that they upgraded from M1 to M2s on the carbine front.
Also fascinating that somebody cared enough to do that. That whoever was in charge said, we've got 30 or so M1 carbines, and I think we'd be better off if they were selective fire, and swapped them out for GI M2s.
Well, there probably comes a reputation thing. I mean, this is the prison no one can ever escape from, right? So the more years went on, the more important it was to keep that record, I assume.
Sure.
So we've talked about the range of handguns for the guards, to long-range rifles, to staving off invasion, to shotguns, automatic weapons, the whole ball of works. Anything else stand out to you about Alcatraz as you were digging into this?
No, just that it's a place I wouldn't want to go. And it was just illustrative that it was a very different time. And it is amazing to see how our culture and society have evolved in the last century. And it's closed down. As I've never been there, but as I understand, it's a tourist attraction now. Despite the fact that the place is pretty big, it's got several floors. The cells were really small, like 9 feet by 7 feet, something like that. I forget exactly, 9 by 5 by 7 feet. So it would have been an absolutely miserable place, and I'm sure would not have passed muster nowadays with ACLU and prisoners' rights sort of folks, but would have been a simply ghastly place to live back then.
Yeah, I always wonder. I tried to imagine. I haven't toured it yet. I've spent a lot of time in San Francisco and trips over the years. And I always imagine how cold and damp it would be, because it actually gets really chilly and breezy out there, especially out in the middle of the bay. Miserable place.
And I doubt that they invested a great deal of effort in creature comforts as far as keeping the place warm or cool.
I have to wonder if they left some windows open on purpose in the winter months,
Yeah,
but
undoubtedly.
all right. Well, this is an absolutely fascinating story. You can read about it in what we refer to as the January-February issue of American Handgunner. It comes out in mid to late November of 2024, about now, depending on when you're watching this video. So be sure and pick that up and give it a read. I'd like to thank Doc Dabbs for sharing some of this story with us. Fantastic stuff. Anyway, if you like this and want more, hit that like button, subscribe to FMG Pubs on YouTube, or always visit us at AmericanHandgunner.com. If you got something to say or heard any cool Alcatraz stories, share them in the comments below. We do keep an eye out on that and would love to hear from you. Have a good one, and we will see you next time.
Tom, thanks, brother.